Chris was only 14 when his world turned upside down. In a small, rain-soaked town where tradition often outweighed compassion, Chris made the bold decision to tell the truth about who he was. But in his family, honesty came with a heavy price. One evening, sitting at the dinner table with his parents, Chris nervously confessed, "Dad? Mom, I need to tell you something. I'm gay." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. His father, Richard, froze, his fork suspended mid-air. His mother, Linda, avoided eye contact, her face a mix of shock and unease. The silence was broken by Richard's furious outburst. "You've ruined this family's name," Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "How dare you shame us like this?" Chris pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please, I didn't choose this. I'm just trying to be honest about who I am." Richard's face turned red with anger. "Honest? You call this honesty? It's a disgrace. No son of mine would ever say something so disgusting. Get out of my house, now." "Chris, maybe it's better if you leave for a while. Your father needs time to escape the anxieties you draw on him. He's having a tough time at school, so you need Pris. Maybe it's better if you leave for a while. Your father needs time to escape anxieties people live in." "Time?" Richard scoffed. "He's not coming back. He's no longer my son." Chris's legs felt weak as he stood, his vision blurred by tears. His home, the one place he thought he would always be safe, had just turned its back on him. Richard tossed a small backpack at his feet, the sound echoing like a final blow. "Take that and go," Richard said, his voice cold and unforgiving, "and don't you dare come back." Chris staggered to the door, his mind racing. Where would he go? What would he do? As he stepped outside, the rain poured down, drenching him instantly. It was as if the sky itself was mourning his loss. He walked aimlessly through the empty streets, his feet splashing through puddles, his tears mixing with the rain. In one night, Chris lost his home, his family, and any sense of safety. Forced to leave with nothing but a backpack and a shattered heart, he wandered into a world colder than the storm around him. But what Chris didn't know was that his journey of rejection would lead to something extraordinary, something that would shake this entire town to its core. This is a story of courage, resilience, and the power of truth. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this. Let us know in the comments, what would you do if you had to fight for who you are? Stay tuned to see how Chris's incredible journey unfolds. The dinner table was quiet, save for the occasional clink of a fork against a plate. Chris's heart pounded as he glanced between his parents, Richard and Linda. This was the moment he had been dreading, but also the one he had rehearsed countless times in his mind. He couldn't hide anymore. "Dad? Mom?" Chris began, his voice trembling. "I need to tell you something." He paused, trying to summon the courage to say the words that had been weighing on him for years. "I'm gay." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard froze, his fork suspended in midair. Linda's eyes widened in shock, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, like a storm breaking, Richard erupted. "You've ruined this family's name," he roared, slamming his fist on the table so hard that the plates rattled. "How dare you shame us like this? Do you have any idea what people will say? How we'll be judged?" Chris's hands shook as he gripped the edge of his chair. "Dad, please, I didn't choose this. I'm just trying to be honest about who I am." Richard's face turned red with anger. "Honest? You call this honesty? It's a disgrace. No son of mine would ever say something so disgusting. Get out of my house, now." Chris's breath hitched as tears streamed down his face. He turned to his mother, hoping for some semblance of comfort or support, But Linda avoided his gaze, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "Chris, maybe it's better if you leave for a while. Your father needs time." "Time?" Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with venom. "He's not coming back. He's no longer my son." Chris's legs felt weak as he stood, his vision blurred by tears. He couldn't believe what was happening. His home, the one place he thought he would always be safe, had just turned its back on him. Richard tossed a small backpack at his feet, the sound echoing like a final blow. "Take that and go," Richard said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "And don't you dare come back." Chris staggered to the door, his mind racing. Where would he go? What would he do? As he stepped outside, the rain poured down, drenching him instantly. It was as if the sky itself was mourning his loss. He walked aimlessly through the empty streets, his feet splashing through puddles, his tears mixing with the rain. As the night deepened, Chris found himself seeking refuge wherever he could. He approached a small, dilapidated building that looked abandoned, hoping to escape the cold. But when he tried to push the door open, a gruff voice stopped him. "Get out of here!" a middle-aged man shouted from inside, his silhouette visible through a cracked window. "We don't need trouble around here." "Please," Chris begged, his voice hoarse from crying. "I just need a place to stay for the night." "I said get lost!" the man yelled, slamming the door shut. Chris stood there, shivering, before turning away into the rain once more. By the time he reached the local park, exhaustion had taken over. He collapsed onto a bench, curling up into a ball to shield himself from the biting cold. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why did his family hate him so much? Why did the world seem so cruel? Just as he began to drift into a restless sleep, he was startled by the sound of laughter. Looking up, he saw a group of teenagers approaching, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. "Well, what do we have here?" one of them sneered, stepping closer. "A little freak all alone in the rain?" Chris tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. I don't want any trouble," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Trouble?" Another boy laughed mockingly. "You're the trouble, aren't you?" Before Chris could react, the group surrounded him, shoving him back onto the bench. Panic surged through him as they jeered and taunted, their words cutting deeper than the cold rain. "Look at you," one of them said. "Pathetic." Chris's survival instincts kicked in. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, he bolted, slipping and sliding on the wet pavement as he ran blindly through the park. The sound of footsteps behind him spurred him on, though his lungs burned and his legs ached. Just as he thought he couldn't go any farther, he spotted a narrow alleyway and darted into it. He crouched behind a dumpster, his heart pounding in his ears as the voices of his pursuers faded into the distance. When he was sure they were gone, Chris collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with fear and exhaustion. That night, as the rain continued to pour, Chris curled up under a tree in the park. His soaked clothes clung to his skin, and the cold seeped into his bones. His mind drifted to his parents, his father's anger, his mother's silence. For the first time in his life, Chris felt truly alone. "I'll prove them wrong," he whispered to himself, though his voice was weak. "I'll survive. I'll show them I'm more than this." Little did Chris know, his journey was just beginning, and it would take him to places he never imagined, places that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Chris awoke to the sound of raindrops pattering against the tree branches above him. His body ached from the cold, and his damp clothes clung to his skin like a second layer of punishment. The sun was barely rising, casting a dull gray light over the park. For a moment, Chris thought it might all have been a bad dream, that he could go home, crawl back into his warm bed, and pretend none of this had happened. But the soreness in his body and the emptiness in his stomach reminded him of the harsh truth. He was alone. Determined to find shelter, Chris wandered through the quiet streets of his small town. Most businesses were still closed, but he spotted a convenience store with its neon "Open" sign flickering in the window. Summoning his courage, Chris pushed the door open, the jingling bell above his head breaking the silence. Behind the counter stood a gruff man in his late 40s, his thick mustache twitching as he sized Chris up. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone less than welcoming. "Just somewhere to stay?" Chris said softly. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, trying to sound stronger than he felt. "It's raining, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The man's expression hardened. "This ain't a shelter, kid. You can't stay here." Chris felt his chest tighten. "Please," he begged. "I'll work, I'll clean, anything." "Look," the man snapped, pointing to the door. "I don't want any trouble. You better leave before someone calls the cops." Chris nodded numbly and stepped back out into the rain. The streets seemed even colder and lonelier now. He continued walking, his shoes squelching with every step, until he reached the edge of town. Ahead, he saw an old abandoned factory. It wasn't much, but it looked like it could offer some relief from the relentless rain. As he approached the factory's crumbling entrance, a voice called out from the shadows. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" Chris froze. From the darkness emerged a middle-aged man with a rugged face and a worn leather jacket. His eyes narrowed suspiciously. "I'm just looking for somewhere to stay," Chris explained, his voice shaking. "I won't cause any trouble." The man stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "This isn't a place for kids like you. Go on, get out of here before you regret it." Chris wanted to argue, but the man's tone left no room for negotiation. With his head hung low, Chris turned away and continued walking. Each rejection chipped away at his already fragile sense of hope. By the time night fell again, Chris had wandered back to the park. This time, he chose a bench near a street lamp, hoping the light would offer some sense of safety. But as the hours passed and the streets emptied, danger found him once more. "Look who we have here," a voice drawled from the shadows. Chris turned to see a group of teenagers approaching, their faces partially obscured by the dim light. They were the same ones who had taunted him the night before. His stomach dropped. "Didn't we tell you to get out of here?" one of them sneered, stepping closer. "This town doesn't need freaks like you." Chris's hands trembled as he stood ready to flee. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trouble? You are the trouble," another boy spat, shoving Chris backward. He stumbled but managed to keep his balance. "Leave me alone," Chris pleaded, his voice cracking. He tried to step away, but the group encircled him. Before he could react, one of them grabbed his backpack and yanked it off his shoulder. "What's in here, Running away from mommy and daddy?" the boy mocked as he rifled through the bag. "Stop it!" Chris shouted, his desperation fueling a burst of courage. He lunged for his bag, but another boy shoved him to the ground. The cold pavement scraped his palms as he tried to catch himself. The sound of laughter and jeering filled the air, but then something unexpected happened. A bright flash of blue and red lights lit up the park. The group of teenagers froze, their faces pale, as a police car rolled into view. "Break it up!" a deep voice commanded over the car's loudspeaker. The boys scattered, leaving Chris on the ground, clutching his torn backpack. A police officer stepped out of the car and approached him, his expression stern. "You okay, kid?" the officer asked, helping Chris to his feet. Chris nodded, though his voice betrayed him when he tried to respond. Yeah, he stammered. The officer studied him for a moment, then said, "This isn't a good place to be hanging around at night. Do you have somewhere to go?" Chris hesitated. He couldn't tell the officer the truth, not about his parents, not about why he was out here. "I'll be fine," he lied. The officer frowned but didn't press further. "Stay out of trouble," he said, before returning to his car and driving away. Alone once again, Chris sat back on the bench, his body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. He stared at the torn strap of his backpack, tears streaming silently down his face. "Why does everyone hate me?" he whispered into the night. But as he sat there, something stirred within him, a tiny flicker of determination. He wouldn't let this be the end of his story. Somewhere out there, someone had to care, someone had to believe that he mattered. Chris didn't know where he would find them, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The next morning, Chris woke up on the same park bench, his body stiff and sore from the cold night. The streets were beginning to stir with the early risers of the town, and Chris knew he couldn't linger. The looks of suspicion and disdain he caught from passers-by were enough to remind him he didn't belong here anymore, or at least, that's how it felt. Dragging himself to his feet, Chris slung his torn backpack over his shoulder and trudged aimlessly. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten in over a day. He passed a small bakery on the corner, the warm aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. For a moment, he considered stepping inside, but the fear of rejection held him back. What if they threw him out, just like everyone else? As he stood hesitating, the door swung open and an older woman stepped out, a tray of pastries in her hands. Her kind eyes met Chris's, and she paused. "You all right there, young man?" she asked, her voice warm but concerned. Chris froze, unsure of how to respond. "I'm fine," he muttered, looking away. "You don't look fine," she said, setting the tray down on a nearby table. "Come inside. You look like you could use something warm." Chris hesitated, but the kindness in her tone broke through his defenses. He followed her into the bakery, the warmth inside instantly wrapping around him like a blanket. The woman, who introduced herself as Eleanor, motioned for him to sit at a small table near the counter. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with a steaming mug of tea and a slice of bread. "Eat," she said firmly, placing them in front of him. Chris's hands trembled as he picked up the bread. He hadn't realized just how hungry he was until the first bite melted in his mouth. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, ashamed of showing weakness in front of a stranger. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Eleanor sat down across from him, watching him carefully. "You don't have to tell me your story," she said gently, "but it's clear you're carrying something heavy. If you need a place to stay for a while, I've got a spare room upstairs. No strings attached." Chris stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. After days of rejection and hostility, this woman, a stranger, was offering him kindness without judgment. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you help me?" Eleanor smiled, her eyes softening. "Because everyone deserves a chance, and because I see a lot of someone I cared about in you." Her expression grew somber. "I once knew a boy like you. He was bright and kind, but the world wasn't kind to him. He didn't make it. And I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone else, if I could help it." Chris didn't know what to say. For the first time in days, he felt a sliver of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. In the days that followed, Chris began helping Eleanor around the bakery. The work was simple, sweeping floors, wiping tables, and occasionally helping mix ingredients, but it gave him a sense of purpose. Eleanor never pried into his past, but her quiet support was enough to make Chris feel like he belonged, even if just for a little while. But the small town wasn't as welcoming. Word quickly spread that Eleanor had taken in the runaway. Customers whispered behind her back, some even refusing to step foot in the bakery. One day, as Chris was cleaning the front counter, a man stormed in. He was tall and imposing, his expression one of disdain. "Eleanor," he barked, pointing at Chris, "do you even know who you're sheltering? That boy's trouble. People are talking and it's not good for business." Eleanor straightened her back, her gaze steady. "If you have a problem with him, then take your business elsewhere." The man's face turned red. "You'll regret this," he hissed before storming out. Chris kept his head down, guilt gnawing at him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause problems for you." Eleanor reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't you dare apologize," she said firmly. "You're not the problem. They are." Despite Eleanor's unwavering support, the pressure from the town grew. Chris could feel the judgmental stares whenever he stepped outside. One evening, as he took out the trash, a group of teenagers confronted him. "Wow, look who's playing house now," one of them sneered. "Think hiding in that bakery makes you one of us? Look who's." Chris tried to ignore them, but they blocked his path. "I just want to be left alone," he said, his voice shaking. "Too bad," another boy said, shoving him hard. Chris stumbled but didn't fall. Before they could do more, Eleanor appeared at the doorway, her voice sharp as a knife. "Enough!" she shouted, marching toward them. "If you don't leave now, I'll call the police." The boys hesitated before retreating, but not before one of them muttered, "This isn't over." That night, as Chris lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he whispered to himself. Eleanor, overhearing his words, stepped into the room. "You're stronger than you think, Chris. Do not turn back now. Please, hope you don't." Chris looked up at her, tears in his eyes. "Why do you believe in me?" "Because," Eleanor said, her voice unwavering, "I've seen what happens when the world crushes someone's spirit, and I refuse to let that happen to you." For the first time in a long time, Chris allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. Days turned into weeks, and Chris slowly settled into a routine at Eleanor's bakery. The work gave him a sense of stability, but the whispers and judgmental stares from the townsfolk never ceased. Each time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of their eyes on him, as if they were silently reminding him he didn't belong. Yet, in Eleanor's warm kitchen, there was a sense of safety he hadn't felt since he left home. One rainy afternoon, Chris was cleaning the bakery's storage room when he stumbled upon an old wooden box tucked away in a corner. It was covered in dust, its hinges creaking as he opened it. Inside, he found a bundle of yellowed letters tied together with a faded ribbon. His curiosity piqued, Chris carefully untied the ribbon and began reading. The letters were heartfelt and filled with longing. They told the story of a man named Daniel who had been deeply in love with someone named R. The emotions in the letters were raw and vulnerable, but what caught Chris's attention was the repeated mention of shame and secrecy. As he read on, a chill ran down his spine. The R in the letters wasn't just anyone. It was his father, Richard. Chris's hands trembled as he held the letters. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His father, the man who had thrown him out for being gay, had once been in a same-sex relationship himself. The hypocrisy was staggering, but beneath his anger, Chris felt a pang of sorrow. Had his father buried his true self out of fear? Was his rejection of Chris rooted in his own unresolved pain? Later that evening, Chris approached Eleanor with the letters in hand. "These were in the storage room," he said hesitantly. "Why do you have them?" Eleanor's expression softened as she took the letters from him. "They belonged to Daniel," she explained. "He was a close friend of mine, like a son. He loved your father deeply, but Richard chose to end their relationship when the pressure from his family became too much." Chris's chest tightened. "Did my father ever care about him?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes misty. "He did, but fear is a powerful thing. Richard married your mother shortly after breaking things off with Daniel, and Daniel, he never recovered. He moved away, And the last I heard, he passed away alone." Chris didn't know what to say. The revelation left him torn between anger and empathy. His father's rejection of him suddenly seemed more complicated, more tragic. Meanwhile, Linda, Chris's mother, was grappling with her own ghosts. Since Chris had left, guilt had begun to consume her. She found herself rummaging through old keepsakes one evening and came across a letter she hadn't read in years. It was from her older brother, Michael, who had also been gay and cast out by their family decades ago. The letter was written from a hospital bed, a final plea for reconciliation that had gone unanswered. In it, Michael had written, "Linda, I don't blame you for staying silent, but silence can be as sharp as any word spoken. I hope one day you'll understand how much it hurt to be abandoned." Tears streamed down Linda's face as she read the words. The weight of her brother's rejection, and now her son's, was unbearable. She had been silent then, and she had been silent when Richard cast Chris out. But this time, her silence felt unforgivable. Back at the bakery, Chris was still grappling with his discovery when a new challenge arose. One morning, Eleanor found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a typed note, the words cold and threatening. "Stop sheltering that boy. He's a disgrace to this town, and you'll regret keeping him here." Eleanor's face hardened as she handed the note to Chris. "Looks like they've decided to escalate," she said. "But don't worry, I've dealt with cowards like this before." Chris tried to brush it off, but deep down he was terrified. The hostility in the town was growing, and he knew it was only a matter of time before something worse happened. His fears were realized one night when he and Eleanor returned to the bakery after closing up. The windows were shattered, and graffiti covered the walls. Words like "freak" and "get out" were scrawled in angry red letters. Chris felt his stomach drop as he stared at the damage. "Oh, this is my fault," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have come here." Eleanor placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Don't you dare blame yourself," she said fiercely. "This is on them, not you, and we're not going to let them scare us." The next day, Eleanor hired a local handyman to repair the damage and refused to close the bakery, despite the risk. "If we back down now, they win," she told Chris. Her resilience was unwavering, but Chris couldn't shake the guilt eating away at him. As if the situation couldn't get more complicated, the man behind the threats revealed himself during a tense town hall meeting about upholding moral values. Chris recognized him immediately. It was one of the teenagers who had attacked him in the park. Now a young adult and a member of the town council, he was using his position to stir up fear and division. Chris stood in the back of the room, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to speak up, to confront the man, but fear held him back. As the meeting dragged on, Chris finally found his voice. "You talk about morals," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "But where's the morality in hate? Where's the morality in throwing a kid out onto the streets because of who they are?" The room fell silent as Chris stepped forward. His words hung in the air, challenging everyone present to examine their own prejudices. That night, as Chris sat in his room, he couldn't stop thinking about the letters, the threats, and the confrontation at the town hall. The pieces of his past were coming together in ways he never expected, and he realized that his story wasn't just about survival. It was about breaking a cycle of fear and rejection that had plagued his family and community for generations. Chris didn't know how the battle would end, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Eleanor, his mother's guilt, and even the memory of his father's hidden past were all part of a larger narrative, one he was determined to rewrite. The threats against Eleanor's bakery grew bolder in the weeks following the town hall meetings. Notes slipped under the door became more frequent, their language sharper and filled with venom. One night, Chris found a rock thrown through the window, with a crude message scrawled on a piece of paper attached. "Leave town, freak." Chris's hands trembled as he held the note. the words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He turned to Eleanor, who was already sweeping up the broken glass with a calmness that felt almost defiant. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm putting you in danger." Eleanor looked up, her expression fierce. "Let me tell you something, kid," she said, setting the broom aside. "Bullies like this, they thrive on fear. The moment you give in, they win. And I'm not about to let them scare me into hiding, and neither should you." Chris wanted to believe her, but the weight of the constant harassment was wearing him down. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was all his fault. One afternoon, while Chris was wiping tables in the bakery, a familiar face walked in. Mason Thompson, a well-known local businessman and council member. His polished appearance and charming demeanor masked the underlying menace Chris could feel radiating from him. "I hear you've been stirring up quite the controversy," Mason said, his voice calm but pointed. He leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on Chris. Chris stiffened but said nothing. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, her gaze narrowing when she saw Mason. "What do you want, Mason?" she asked, her tone cold. "I'm just here to talk," Mason replied smoothly. "You know, Eleanor, this town values its traditions. What you're doing here, harboring this boy, supporting his lifestyle, it's causing quite a stir. I'd hate for your bakery to suffer because of it." Eleanor folded her arms across her chest. "Are you threatening me?" "Of course not," Mason said with a thin smile. "I'm simply pointing out the reality of the situation. You have a reputation to uphold. Think about your business, your legacy. Is this really worth it?" Chris couldn't stay silent any longer. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside him. "Why are you so afraid of someone like me?" Mason's smile faltered for a moment, and Chris caught a flicker of something, shame, pain, in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You wouldn't understand," Mason said, before turning and walking out the door. Later that night, Chris found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in her hands. She seemed lost in thought. "You don't have to fight this battle for me," he said quietly as he sat across from her. "It's not your responsibility." Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "You remind me of someone I loved very much," she said. "Daniel. You know about him, don't you?" Chris nodded. He'd read the letters, but hearing Eleanor speak about Daniel brought a new weight to the story. "Daniel was brave, just like you," she continued, "but the world broke him. He didn't have anyone to stand up for him, and I'll never forgive myself for not doing more. This time, I won't make the same mistake." Chris didn't know how to respond. All he could do was nod, his throat tight with emotion. A few days later, the threats escalated. Chris arrived at the bakery early in the morning to find the word "abomination" spray-painted across the front door. His stomach churned as he stared at the hateful message. Eleanor arrived shortly after, and her face darkened when she saw the vandalism. "That's it," she said, pulling out her phone. "We're reporting this." Chris hesitated. "What if it makes things worse?" "It might," Eleanor admitted, "but staying silent won't make it better." The police arrived within the hour, but their response was lukewarm at best. "We'll file a report," one officer said dismissively, "but there's not much we can do unless you catch them in the act." Chris's frustration boiled over. "So you're just going to do nothing?" he demanded. The officer gave him a pitying look. "Welcome to small-town justice, kid." Despite the lack of support from the authorities, Eleanor refused to back down. She hired a local artist to paint a vibrant mural over the graffiti, a bold declaration that the bakery stood for love and acceptance. The mural featured a rainbow of colors and the words, "All are welcome here." The mural sparked outrage among some of the townsfolk, But it also drew in new customers, people who supported Eleanor and Chris but had been too afraid to speak up until now. Slowly, a small but vocal group of allies began to emerge. The turning point came during another town hall meeting. This time, Chris decided he couldn't stay silent. He stood up in front of the room, his heart pounding, and addressed the council directly. "I've been called a disgrace, an abomination, and worse," he began, his voice shaking but resolute. "But what's truly disgraceful is the hate and fear that's tearing this town apart. I didn't choose to be who I am, but you all have a choice, to be better, to show kindness instead of cruelty." Mason, who was sitting among the council members, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time, Chris saw him as something other than an enemy. He saw a man wrestling with his own demons. After the meeting, Mason approached Chris in the parking lot. "You're brave," he said, his tone softer than before. "Braver than I ever was." Chris stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Mason hesitated, then sighed. "I'll just say this. We all have our secrets. Some of us are better at hiding them than others." With that, he walked away, leaving Chris with more questions than answers. That night, as Chris sat in his room, he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. The fight was far from over, but he wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, the tides were beginning to turn. The days leading up to the grand opening of the LGBTQ+ center were tense. The bakery had become a hub of activity as volunteers from the newly formed support group worked tirelessly alongside Eleanor and Chris to prepare. Yet, the air was thick with unease. The threats hadn't stopped, and the pressure from the more conservative factions of the town was mounting. Chris knew the opening ceremony would be a turning point, not just for him, but for the entire town. Either they would take a step toward acceptance, or they would allow hatred and fear to continue ruling their lives. Despite his anxiety, Chris was determined to make his voice heard. The morning of the event was clear and crisp, the kind of day that seemed to hold promise. A small stage had been set up in front of the bakery, which had been transformed into a vibrant symbol of love and acceptance. The mural on the front wall shone brightly in the sunlight, and rainbow banners fluttered in the breeze. As the crowd gathered, Chris stood backstage, his hands trembling. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're ready for this," she said, her voice steady. "Speak from the heart, and they'll listen." Chris nodded, though his stomach churned. He peeked through the curtain and saw a mix of faces, some familiar, others not. Supporters mingled nervously, their bright flags contrasting sharply with the somber expressions of the protesters standing at the edges of the crowd. Among them, he spotted Mason Thompson, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. As the event began, Eleanor took the stage first, her voice calm and resolute. "We're here today because this town needs to change," she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Change isn't easy, and it isn't quick, but it starts with moments like this, with people brave enough to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.'" She introduced Chris, who took a deep breath and stepped forward. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a mix of curiosity and hostility. Chris's heart pounded, but he forced himself to meet their gazes. "My name is Chris," he began, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "A few months ago, I was thrown out of my home for being who I am. I was told I was a disgrace, that I didn't belong. For a long time, I believed it. But then I realized something. The problem wasn't me. It was the fear and hate that had poisoned this town." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. He saw his mother, Linda, standing near the back of the crowd, her eyes filled with tears. He couldn't tell if they were tears of regret or pride, but it didn't matter. He pressed on. "I'm not here to change who I am to fit your expectations," Chris continued. "I'm here to tell every kid who's ever felt like they didn't belong that they are enough. that they have a right to exist, to love, and to be loved. The crowd was silent for a moment before a voice rang out. "What about tradition?" It was Mason, his voice cutting through the stillness. "What about the values this town was built on?" Chris turned to face him, his jaw tightening. "Tradition is important," he said, "but not when it's used to justify hate. If your values make you turn your back on your neighbors, then maybe it's time to reevaluate them." Mason's face reddened, but before he could respond, another voice broke through the tension. "He's right." The crowd turned to see Linda stepping forward, her hands trembling. "I've spent too long staying silent," she said, her voice cracking. "I lost my brother because I was too afraid to stand up for him, and I almost lost my son for the same reason. But no more. I support Chris, and I'm proud of him." Her words sent a ripple through the crowd. Some murmured in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. Mason, however, looked as though he had been struck. The tension reached its peak when a group of protesters began chanting, their voices growing louder and angrier. Chris's pulse quickened as they surged toward the stage, their banners raised high with hateful messages. But before they could get too close, a group of allies, led by Eleanor and a few brave townsfolk, formed a barrier around the stage, their arms linked in solidarity. "You'll have to go through us first," Eleanor said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. The standoff was intense, the crowd holding its breath as the two groups faced off. Finally, Mason stepped forward, raising a hand to silence the protesters. "Enough," he said, his voice heavy. "This isn't the way." Now that the morning had come for Mason's decision, he realized he still didn't have his procedure manual. He turned to Chris, his expression unreadable. "You've made your point. Let's see if you can live up to it." With that, Mason walked away, the protesters following reluctantly. The tension eased, and a cheer erupted from the supporters in the crowd. Chris stepped back to the microphone, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is what change looks like," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It's messy, it's uncomfortable, but it's worth it. And it starts here, with all of us." As he finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Tears streamed down Chris's face as he looked out at the sea of people. His allies, his supporters, and even those who had once stood against him. For the first time, he felt the weight of his journey begin to lift. That night, as Chris stood outside the bakery with Eleanor and Linda, he couldn't help but smile. The LGBTQ+ Center was officially open, its bright lights a beacon of hope in the dark town. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a start. "You did good, kid," Eleanor said, squeezing his shoulder. "Real good." Chris looked up at the stars, his heart full for the first time in months. "This isn't just for me," he said. "It's for everyone who's ever felt like I did, and we're just getting started." The events of the grand opening marked a turning point in Chris's journey, but the days that followed were far from simple. The LGBTQ+ Center had opened its doors, welcoming those who felt like outcasts, but the scars of rejection and fear still lingered. For Chris, the hardest part was yet to come, facing his family. A week after the opening, Chris was working late at the center when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. His mother, Linda, stood hesitantly, clutching her purse as if it were a lifeline. She looked smaller somehow, her usually composed face etched with lines of regret. "Hi, Chris," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" Chris hesitated. The wounds from her silence still felt fresh, but he nodded, gesturing for her to sit. The two of them sat across from each other in the quiet room, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. "I owe you an apology," Linda began, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was wrong about everything. I let fear control me, just like it controlled your father. But when I saw you stand up at the opening, so brave and strong, I realized I've been a coward my entire life." Chris looked away, his emotions swirling. "Why now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why couldn't you have stood up for me when I needed you most?" Linda's tears spilled over as she reached into her purse and pulled out a weathered letter. "I've been holding on to this for years," she said, handing it to Chris. "It's from my brother Michael. He wrote it before he passed and I ignored it, just like I ignored his pain and yours." Chris unfolded the letter, the faded ink revealing Michael's plea for reconciliation. "I hope one day you'll find the strength to stand up for what's right," it read. Chris's throat tightened as he finished the letter, its message both heartbreaking and eerily prophetic. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Linda said, her voice breaking. "But I want you to know that I'm here now. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Chris was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," he said honestly. "But I appreciate that you're trying. Maybe, with time." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't the resolution she'd hoped for, but it was a start. A few days later, Chris received an unexpected visitor at the bakery. His father, Richard, stood awkwardly in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked older, more worn down than Chris remembered. "Can we talk?" Richard asked, his voice gruff but quieter than usual. Chris crossed his arms, unsure if he wanted to hear what his father had to say. But Eleanor, who was watching from behind the counter, gave him an encouraging nod. Reluctantly, Chris stepped outside with his father. "I don't even know where to start," Richard admitted, staring at the ground. "I've made a lot of mistakes, more than I can count." Chris stayed silent, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I pushed you away because I was afraid," Richard continued, his voice cracking. "Afraid of what people would think, afraid of facing parts of myself I've buried a long time ago. But seeing you stand up there at that event, I saw more courage in you than I've ever had." Chris's heart clenched as his father's words hung in the air. "You threw me out?" he said, his voice trembling. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" Richard nodded, his eyes glistening. "I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make amends, if you'll let me." For a moment, Chris considered turning his back and walking away, but then he thought of Eleanor's words. Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for you. With a deep breath, he said, "It's going to take time, but maybe we can start with a conversation." As weeks turned into months, Chris began the slow process of rebuilding his relationships with his parents. Linda started volunteering at the LGBTQ+ center, learning about the community she had once feared. Richard, though still struggling with his past, made an effort to show up for Chris in ways he never had before. The bakery and the center became symbols of resilience and love, drawing in people from all walks of life. Chris often found himself looking around, marveling at how far he had come. The boy who once sat alone on a park bench, drenched in rain and despair, was now surrounded by a family, chosen and biological, that believed in him. One evening, as Chris closed up the center, Eleanor joined him outside. They sat on the steps, watching the stars. "You did it," Eleanor said, her voice filled with pride. "You changed this town." Chris smiled, his heart full. "I didn't do it alone," he replied. "I had you." Eleanor chuckled. "Maybe, but you were the one brave enough to take the first step, and that's what matters." Chris looked up at the sky, the stars shining brightly above. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting, and no matter how dark it gets, there's always a light waiting at the end." Chris's journey reminds us that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing up even when you are, It's about choosing love over fear and forgiveness over bitterness. And it's about knowing that no matter how far you've fallen, you can always rise again. Call to action. If Chris's story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Let us know in the comments, what's a moment in your life where you had to choose between fear and courage? We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next video.